I didn't even say a word, but by the next morning, my entire family was already trending online, and I was the villain in a story I never agreed to be part of. My name is Emma Carter, and I still remember the exact moment everything started falling apart, even though at the time I had no idea it was the beginning of something that would completely change how my family saw me, and how strangers on the internet would decide who I was without ever meeting me. It began with a video posted by my brother, Jason Carter, late on a Friday night, a simple upload that he probably thought would stay within our circle of friends and relatives, but within hours it spread far beyond anything any of us could control. He did not see it immediately. He found out the next morning when my phone would not stop lighting up with notifications, each one more aggressive than the last. Comments from strangers who already had opinions about my character, my actions, and my place in my own family. When I finally opened the video, I realized it was edited in a way that made everything look worse than it actually was. Small moments taken out of context, conversations rearranged, expressions frozen at the worst possible timing. It was not just a clip, it was a narrative, and I had somehow been cast as the center of it without any chance to respond. By the time I walked into the kitchen that morning, I could already feel the shift in the atmosphere inside my own home. My mother, Linda Carter, avoided eye contact, moving around quietly as if she was trying to decide which version of me she believed. My father, Michael Carter, sat at the table scrolling through his phone with a tense expression that I had never seen directed at me before. And Jason, my brother, the person who had uploaded the video, stood near the counter acting like nothing unusual had happened, as if the consequences unfolding around us were something distant from his actions. I remember asking him calmly why he posted it, expecting at least a conversation, but instead I was met with silence and a shrug that felt heavier than any explanation. Within a few hours, the situation escalated beyond our home. Friends began messaging me questions that already assumed guilt. Relatives who had never spoken to me directly were suddenly sharing their opinions about what they had seen online. The video had become a lens, and through that lens, my entire identity was being rewritten by people who only knew a fragment of the story. I tried to defend myself at first, but every attempt felt like speaking into a space that was already filled with judgment. The more I explained, the more it seemed like I was confirming their assumptions rather than changing them. By the end of that day, I stopped trying to respond altogether. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I realized no one was listening to me as a person anymore. They were reacting to a version of me that had been constructed without my input. And in that silence, while my family debated what to believe and strangers continued to comment, I began to notice something that no one else was paying attention to yet, something small, simple, and digital, but powerful enough to change everything that had already been decided about me. By the time I realized the full scale of what the video had done, it was no longer just a family issue confined to our home or even our relatives. It had already become something larger, something uncontrollable, something that existed in the space where public opinion forms faster than truth can catch up. My name is Emma Carter, and I remember sitting alone in my room that afternoon, watching my phone screen fill with notifications that did not slow down, each one carrying a new interpretation of the same video my brother, Jason Carter, had posted the night before. What struck me most was not only the number of people reacting, but the certainty in their reactions, as if they had been present in the moments recorded, as if context did not matter anymore once something had been seen enough times online. Inside the house, the silence felt different now. It was not the silence of calm, but the silence of people avoiding confrontation. My mother, Linda Carter, moved through the kitchen in short, distracted motions, glancing at me only briefly before looking away again, as if unsure how to interpret what she had seen online compared to what she had known all her life. My father, Michael Carter, remained mostly in his chair, his phone in hand, scrolling through comments and reposts, his expression tightening each time he looked at the screen, not speaking directly but clearly absorbing the weight of external judgment. Jason, however, acted differently. He moved through the house with a strange sense of detachment, not acknowledging the scale of what had happened, not correcting it, not explaining it, simply existing as if the outcome was separate from his responsibility. I remember asking him again, more directly this time, why he had posted the video in the first place, and his response was not defensive or emotional, but minimal, as if the consequences were something that belonged to the internet rather than to the family standing in front of him. Outside our home, the situation continued to escalate in a way that felt increasingly disconnected from reality. Messages arrived from distant relatives, some asking questions, others making assumptions, and some simply repeating what they had already seen without adding anything new. The video itself had been shared, reshape, and clipped into shorter segments, each version slightly different, each one reinforcing a narrative that was becoming harder to reverse with every passing hour. He began to notice that no one was asking what actually happened in full context. They were responding to fragments that had already been accepted as complete truth. At school later that week, I could feel the shift even without anyone speaking directly about it. Conversations paused when I walked by, and subtle reactions replaced direct engagement. It was not hostility in an obvious form, but something quieter, more socially reinforced, like a consensus that had formed without my participation. He tried once more to explain the situation to someone I trusted, but I quickly realized that the explanation itself was no longer the issue. The issue was that the video had already defined the starting point of belief, and anything I said after that was interpreted as reaction rather than truth. Back at home, the tension between family members became less about the original event and more about interpretation. My mother began asking careful questions without fully taking a side. My father remained focused on the implications rather than the accuracy, and Jason continued to behave as though the digital outcome was separate from the emotional reality unfolding around us. It was in this environment, surrounded by divided perception and uncontrolled narrative expansion, that I began to understand something important. Responding directly was no longer enough, because the structure of belief had already been built without me. And in that realization, while everyone around me continued reacting to what they had seen, I started focusing on something else entirely, something quiet, something digital, something that had not yet been noticed by anyone who thought the story was already finished. As the situation around the video continued to evolve beyond anything I could control directly, I began to understand that the real conflict was no longer happening in my home, but in the invisible space where perception is shaped by repetition, sharing, and interpretation without context. My name is Emma Carter, and by the third day after the video was posted by my brother, Jason Carter, I could clearly see that the narrative had already hardened into something that felt permanent to everyone who had only seen fragments of it online. The comments, the reposts, and the discussions had stopped focusing on what actually happened and instead focused on what people believed had happened, which were not the same thing anymore. Inside the house, the atmosphere had shifted again, becoming more restrained, almost cautious, as if every conversation needed to be filtered before being spoken. My mother, Linda Carter, had started avoiding discussions about the video entirely, choosing instead to focus on unrelated tasks, while my father, Michael Carter, seemed increasingly absorbed in his phone, as if trying to understand how quickly perception could turn into judgment without any formal process. Jason, however, remained unchanged in his behavior, still acting as though the situation had reached its natural conclusion, as if uploading the video was the end of his responsibility rather than the beginning of its consequences. I remember noticing that no one in the family was actively addressing the growing external narrative anymore. Instead, each person was reacting internally in different ways, creating distance between us without any direct confrontation. Outside our home, the situation had expanded further, reaching people I did not know, with messages and comments becoming more layered and more confident in their assumptions. The video had been broken down into smaller segments, each one circulated independently, each one reinforcing the same simplified interpretation, removing any possibility of context restoration. It was at this point that I stopped trying to correct what people were saying, because I realized that correction required a shared foundation of attention, and that foundation no longer existed. Instead, I began observing something different. I started paying attention to the structure behind the spread itself, how quickly content moved, how selectively it was interpreted, and how easily a single perspective could become dominant once it reached enough repetition. At school, the change was subtle but consistent. Conversations would stop when I approached, not out of hostility, but out of uncertainty, as if people were trying to decide which version of the story they believed before speaking to me directly. I could feel that I was no longer being engaged with as a person, but as a reference point to something already defined online. That realization created a sense of separation that was difficult to explain, because it was not based on one specific action, but on accumulation. Meanwhile, at home, the family dynamic continued to shift in quieter ways. My mother began asking indirect questions about the situation, as if trying to reconstruct missing context without openly challenging what had already been seen. My father became more reserved, spending more time reviewing reactions than engaging in discussion. Jason, on the other hand, remained emotionally detached from the outcome, continuing to treat the situation as something that existed outside of personal accountability. And, in the middle of all of this, I found myself focusing less on response and more on structure. I started noticing patterns in how the video was being shared, which parts were emphasized, which parts were ignored, and how quickly interpretations solidified once they were repeated enough times. It became clear to me that direct explanation would never be enough to change something that had already been stabilized through repetition. Instead, what mattered was not what I said next, but what information had not yet been seen by the right people. And in that space, while everyone else continued reacting to what had already spread, I quietly began preparing something that no one in my family had noticed yet. Something that existed outside of their current understanding of the story, something that would not respond to the narrative, but would interrupt it entirely. By the fourth stage of what had once been a simple family incident turned public, I had reached a point of clarity that no longer depended on trying to respond to what people were saying, but instead on understanding how completely the narrative had already separated from the original reality. My name is Emma Carter. And I remember waking up that morning with a different kind of awareness, not shaped by emotion or shock, but by observation, because the video my brother Jason Carter had posted was still circulating, still being reshared, and still generating interpretations that had very little connection to what had actually taken place inside our home. At this point, I no longer checked notifications to defend myself, because every new comment followed the same pattern, repeating ideas that had already been established by earlier viewers, as if repetition itself had replaced verification. Inside the house, the environment had settled into a quieter form of tension, one that did not require argument to exist. My mother, Linda Carter, moved through the day in a more distant rhythm, avoiding direct references to the situation while clearly aware that it had become something larger than any single conversation could resolve. My father, Michael Carter, appeared increasingly preoccupied with understanding how quickly external perception could override personal knowledge, spending long periods silently reviewing posts and reactions, as if trying to locate the exact point where interpretation had replaced truth. Jason, however, remained consistent in his emotional distance, continuing to act as though the consequences unfolding outside the house were unrelated to his original action, treating the ongoing reaction as something separate from intent. What I began to notice most clearly was that the conflict was no longer about the video itself, but about the stability of the narrative it had created, and how resistant that narrative had become to anything that contradicted it. At school, the pattern continued in subtle but unmistakable ways. People no longer reacted with surprise or curiosity. Instead, they reacted with preformed assumptions that required no additional input from me. It was as if the video had completed the process of defining my role before I had any opportunity to speak within it. That realization changed how I approached everything that followed, because I understood that direct explanation was now structurally ineffective against a system that had already decided what it believed. At home, I began to withdraw from discussions not out of defeat, but out of calculation, observing instead of participating, watching how each family member processed the same situation differently depending on their emotional proximity to the original event. My mother's hesitation, my father's analytical frustration, and Jason's detachment all formed a fragmented response to a single external force that none of us could fully control anymore. It was during this phase that I stopped focusing on correction and started focusing entirely on structure. I paid attention to how the video continued to move through different networks, how certain segments were repeatedly highlighted while others were ignored, and how quickly those patterns solidified into collective belief. The more I observed, the clearer it became that visibility was not the same as accuracy, and that once a version of a story gained enough momentum, it began to function independently of its origin. That understanding led me to something I had not yet shared with anyone in my family. While they were still trying to process what had already happened, I had begun identifying the specific pathways through which the narrative had spread, and more importantly, the points where it could still be interrupted. It was not about confrontation, and it was not about argument. It was about timing, distribution, and precision. And in that quiet space between reaction and recognition, I prepared something that existed outside of their current understanding, something that did not depend on being believed immediately, but on being seen by the right eyes at the exact moment when belief could no longer stabilize itself. By the time I reached what felt like the midpoint of everything that had started with a single video posted by my brother Jason Carter, the situation had evolved into something far more structured than emotional reaction or family disagreement, becoming instead a system of perception that operated independently of intent, context, or correction. My name is Emma Carter, and I remember that by this stage, I no longer measured progress by whether people believed me or not, but by how the narrative itself was behaving as it moved through different layers of social visibility. The video was still circulating, still being reshared, and still generating interpretations that were increasingly detached from the original moment it had captured. And what struck me most was how stable those interpretations had become, as if repetition had replaced uncertainty entirely. Inside the house, the atmosphere had settled into a kind of restrained coexistence, where no one was openly arguing anymore, but no one was truly aligned either. My mother, Linda Carter, had adopted a pattern of cautious silence whenever the subject came near, as if speaking too directly about it might intensify something already beyond control. My father, Michael Carter, had shifted into a more analytical mode, spending long stretches of time reviewing the online reactions, not to engage emotionally, but to understand how perception had escalated so quickly without formal correction. Jason, however, remained largely unchanged in his behavior, continuing to treat the situation as something external to responsibility, as though the consequences existed in a separate system from the action that created them. What became increasingly clear to me during this phase was that the family was no longer reacting to the event itself, but to the echo of the event as it existed online, which meant every conversation was now influenced by something none of us could directly see or fully control. At school, I noticed the same pattern continuing, but in a more refined form, where people no longer referenced the video directly, yet still operated under its influence in subtle social cues, delayed conversations, and selective engagement. He realized that the story had reached a point where correction was no longer a matter of explanation, because the narrative had already stabilized through repetition and external validation. Instead of trying to restore what had been lost, I began focusing entirely on how that stabilization had occurred, observing which parts of the video were most frequently shared, which interpretations spread fastest, and how quickly simplified versions replaced more complex understanding. This shift in attention changed everything about how I saw the situation, because I began to recognize that influence was not linear, but structural, depending on timing, visibility, and reinforcement rather than truth alone. It was during this period that I started organizing what I had discovered into something more precise, not as a reaction, but as a response that did not rely on immediate confrontation. He identified specific points in the spread where the narrative had been amplified, moments where context had been removed, and pathways where attention was most concentrated. These were not emotional observations, but structural ones, and they revealed something important. The same system that had created the misunderstanding also contained points where it could be interrupted. Inside the house, nothing had been openly resolved, but something had shifted internally within me, because I was no longer waiting for permission to be understood. Instead, I was preparing to introduce something into the system that would not ask for interpretation, but would demand re-evaluation. And in that preparation, while everyone else continued to live inside the consequences of a story already accepted as complete, I focused entirely on the moment where that completeness could be disrupted by a single action delivered at the precise point where attention could no longer avoid it. By the time I entered what I now understood as the structural turning point of everything that began with Jason Carter uploading that video, I had already moved beyond reacting to the situation as a family crisis and was instead operating within a clearer understanding of how narratives behave once they leave their original context and enter uncontrolled digital circulation. My name is Emma Carter, and I remember that at this stage, the video was no longer just a single piece of content being discussed, but a reference point that had fragmented into multiple interpretations, each one reinforcing itself through repetition across different audiences. Inside our home, the atmosphere had stabilized into something quieter but more distant, where conversation was minimal and every mention of the situation carried an unspoken weight that no one wanted to fully confront. My mother, Linda Carter, continued to avoid direct engagement with the subject, focusing instead on daily routines as if maintaining normal structure could contain the emotional instability that had already spread beyond our control. My father, Michael Carter, had become increasingly analytical in his behavior, treating the online reactions as data rather than emotion, trying to understand how perception could diverge so quickly from what he believed to be the actual sequence of events. Jason, however, remained consistent in his detachment, continuing to act as though the outcome of the video existed independently from his responsibility in creating it, maintaining a behavioral distance from the consequences that continued to expand outside the household. What I noticed most clearly during this phase was that the family dynamic had stopped evolving through direct interaction and had instead become shaped by external feedback loops, meaning every internal reaction was now influenced by what was happening outside rather than what was being said within the home. At school, the pattern had become even more subtle, with fewer direct references but a stronger sense of underlying assumption, as if the video had permanently altered how people interpreted my presence without requiring ongoing discussion. He no longer attempted to correct individual misunderstandings, because I recognized that correction operated on the assumption of shared attention, and that shared attention no longer existed in a stable form. Instead, I focused entirely on mapping the structure of how the narrative moved, identifying which platforms amplified it most effectively, which segments were repeatedly isolated, and how quickly simplified interpretations replaced complex context. This shift in focus allowed me to see something that had not been visible before. The story was no longer being controlled by its origin, but by the patterns of its distribution. Within those patterns, I began to identify specific points where the narrative became vulnerable, not through argument or confrontation, but through interruption at the level of visibility and timing. I started organizing these observations into a single coherent action plan, not to respond emotionally, but to reintroduce structure where none currently existed. While everyone around me continued reacting to a version of events that had already been stabilized through repetition, I concentrated on the moment where that stability could be disrupted by controlled exposure of missing context. It was not about proving anyone wrong in a direct sense, but about restoring sequence where fragmentation had taken over. And in that quiet transition from observation to preparation, I understood that the next step would no longer involve interpretation or discussion, but the precise release of information into the exact point in the system where it could no longer be ignored or reshaped by assumption. By the time I reached what felt like the final stage of preparation before everything would change, I no longer saw the situation involving Jason Carter's video as something that was still unfolding in real time, but rather as a completed structure that only needed a single interruption point to collapse and rebuild itself into something closer to reality. My name is Emma Carter, and I remember that during this phase, my awareness had shifted entirely away from emotional reaction and toward precision, because I had already seen how quickly a narrative becomes fixed once it reaches enough repetition across digital platforms. Inside our home, the environment had settled into a controlled silence where everyone functioned around the situation without directly engaging it, as if speaking about it too openly would only reinforce its presence rather than resolve it. My mother, Linda Carter, continued to avoid direct discussion, focusing instead on small domestic routines that gave her a sense of structure while everything else remained unstable. My father, Michael Carter, had become increasingly absorbed in analyzing the external response, spending long periods reviewing comments, shares, and discussions as if trying to locate the exact point where interpretation had separated from the original event. Jason, however, remained consistent in his emotional distance, continuing to behave as though the consequences of the video existed independently from his responsibility in creating it, maintaining a level of detachment that made him appear unaffected by the scale of what had developed. What I began to notice most clearly during this stage was that the household itself had become influenced more by external perception than internal communication, meaning that even silence was now shaped by what was happening online rather than by direct conversation between us. At school and in public spaces, the pattern had become fully established, where people no longer engaged with me based on direct interaction, but instead based on an assumed understanding formed from repeated exposure to a fragmented version of the original video. He stopped trying to correct these interpretations individually, because I understood that correction required a shared foundation of attention, and that foundation no longer existed in a stable form. Instead, I focused entirely on the structure of distribution, observing how content moved, how certain fragments were emphasized while others were ignored, and how quickly simplified narratives replaced more complex realities once they gained momentum. This analytical perspective revealed something important. The story was no longer controlled by its origin, but by the system through which it was being consumed and repeated. Within that system, I began to identify specific points where the narrative could be interrupted, not through confrontation or argument, but through the introduction of missing context at precise moments of visibility. I organized everything I had observed into a single planned action, understanding that timing would determine whether the information I had would be dismissed or recognized as structurally significant. While everyone around me continued reacting to a version of events that had already stabilized through repetition, I concentrated on the exact point where that stability could no longer sustain itself if even a small portion of excluded truth was reintroduced. It was not about proving anyone wrong through dialogue, but about restoring sequence to something that had been fragmented into isolated interpretations. And in that transition from observation to execution, I understood that the next step would no longer be about understanding what had happened, but about carefully placing information back into the system at the exact moment where it could no longer be ignored, reshape, or diluted by assumption. By the time I reached the moment where everything I had been observing and preparing for was finally ready to be put into motion, I no longer thought of the situation involving Jason Carter's video as something that could be resolved through discussion, because discussion had already been absorbed into a larger system of repetition and interpretation that no longer responded to correction in real time. My name is Emma Carter, and I remember that on that day, I sat alone in my room for a long time, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood that what I was about to do would not immediately change what people believed. But it would change what they were able to continue believing once they saw what had been missing from the narrative all along. Inside the house, everything appeared normal on the surface, but that normality was now something fragile and performative rather than stable, because each family member had adapted in different ways to the pressure created by the video. My mother, Linda Carter, continued moving through daily routines with careful restraint, avoiding unnecessary conversation about the situation, as if silence could prevent further escalation. My father, Michael Carter, remained deeply engaged with external reactions, still trying to understand how perception had spread so far beyond the original context, reviewing comments and discussions with increasing focus, as though searching for a point where the narrative could be logically corrected. Jason, however, remained the least changed in outward behavior, continuing to act as though the consequences were not directly connected to his initial decision to post the video, maintaining emotional distance from the outcome that had now fully expanded beyond the household. What I understood at this stage was that none of them were interacting with the original event anymore. They were all interacting with interpretations that had been reinforced by repetition, which meant that truth itself was no longer the central reference point for most reactions surrounding us. At school and in public spaces, the pattern had become even more defined, where people no longer approached me with questions, but with conclusions that had already been formed independently of any direct conversation. He had stopped attempting to correct those assumptions individually, because I realized that correction requires a shared moment of attention, and that shared moment no longer existed in a stable form across the environment I was navigating. Instead, I focused entirely on timing, structure, and exposure, because those were the only elements that still had the potential to interrupt a narrative that had already stabilized through repetition. The link I had prepared was not designed to argue, explain, or defend. It was designed to reintroduce missing context at a point where it could no longer be filtered out or reduced into another simplified interpretation. I remember sitting with my phone in my hand, carefully reviewing everything one last time, not because I doubted the content, but because I understood that once it was released, I would no longer control how people reacted to it, only the moment at which they encountered it. The household remained quiet in the background, each person absorbed in their own way of managing a situation that none of us had been able to fully contain since the video first spread. And in that quiet separation between awareness and action, I finally made the decision to send the link, not broadly, not emotionally, but precisely to the specific channels where the narrative had formed its strongest version of itself. The moment I pressed send, there was no immediate reaction that I could see from within the house, no visible change in real time, but I knew that outside this room, within the digital space where the story had taken shape, something had just been introduced that did not belong to interpretation, but to structure itself. And as I set my phone down, I understood that what would happen next would no longer depend on what anyone believed about me, but on what they could no longer ignore once the missing piece of the story began to circulate through the same system that had originally erased it. By the time I reached what I understood to be the final unfolding of everything that began with Jason Carter uploading that single video, I was no longer waiting for validation from anyone inside my home or outside it, because the system of perception had already been set into motion, and what I had introduced into it was no longer something I could contain once it began to circulate. My name is Emma Carter, and I remember sitting in silence after sending the link, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood that the moment of action had already passed and what remained was the period where consequences propagate independently of intent. Inside the house, there was no immediate visible reaction, only a continuation of the same restrained atmosphere that had defined the days since the video first spread, but I could feel a subtle shift in behavior that came not from direct communication, but from the way people began to interact with their phones more frequently, as if something new had entered the system of information they were already processing. My mother, Linda Carter, remained quiet, her attention divided between daily routines and intermittent checking of online updates, her emotional restraint now shaped more by uncertainty than by avoidance. My father, Michael Carter, appeared increasingly focused on external reactions, but something had changed in his expression during this phase, a slight interruption in certainty that suggested he was beginning to register information that did not align with the narrative he had previously accepted as complete. Jason, however, continued to maintain his original posture of detachment, still behaving as though the situation existed outside the scope of his responsibility, even as the environment around him began to shift in ways that were no longer aligned with his initial interpretation of control. What I understood at this stage was that the narrative was no longer moving in a single direction, it was beginning to fracture as new information entered the same channels that had previously solidified a simplified version of events. At school and in public spaces, I began to notice changes that were not immediate reversals, but gradual hesitations in the way people engaged with the story they thought they already understood. Conversations that once ended quickly now paused slightly longer, as if additional context was being processed in real time. He did not engage directly with these reactions, because I understood that the effectiveness of what I had done depended not on explanation, but on visibility at scale. The link I had sent had reached the same spaces where the original video had gained momentum, but unlike the original clip, it carried information that reintroduced sequence, context, and missing structure that had been removed in the initial spread. Inside our home, the emotional landscape began to reorganize itself in subtle ways, not through confrontation, but through recognition that something previously unseen was now being acknowledged by others outside the family system. My mother's silence shifted slightly, no longer purely avoidance, but cautious attention, as if she was beginning to reevaluate what she thought she had already understood. My father's focus on external reactions became more concentrated, but less certain, suggesting that the stability of his interpretation was being challenged by incoming information that did not align with earlier assumptions. Casson's reaction, however, remained the least developed, still grounded in detachment, even as the structure around him began to respond in ways that no longer supported his original framing of events. What I observed most clearly during this final phase was that the narrative did not collapse instantly, but began to reorganize itself under the weight of restored context, creating friction between what had been widely believed and what was now reappearing in the same digital space. And in that transition, I realized that the outcome was no longer defined by who spoke the loudest or who responded first, but by what information could no longer be excluded once it re-entered the system at the precise moment where attention was already fully engaged. And as I remained in silence, I understood that the story had not ended with the posting of the video, nor with the reaction it caused, but with the moment when the missing structure finally returned to the place where it had been removed, forcing everything that had been built on absence to confront the presence of what it had ignored.